Before history found words, a city rose in the highlands of Mexico. Vast, deliberate. No one remembers its name. No ruler left a mark. No chronicle tells its birth. Yet its ruins still command the horizon like a question. Travelers have walked its empty avenues for centuries, sensing a presence. Something larger than the people who once built it. Something older than memory. Stone by stone, a civilization shaped the earth into mirrors of the heavens, carving meaning into silence. Without warning, the voices stopped. The fires went out. What remained was a ghost, a city so perfect it survived its own disappearance. At the heart of the Mexican plateau, a wide basin cradled by mountains lay sleeping beneath veils of mist. It was a land of water and fire, lakes glimmering under volcanic peaks that could, without warning, devour the sky. Long before Teotihuacan rose, the Valley of Mexico was a place of quiet abundance and quiet peril. From its marshes and riverbanks came maize and maguey. From its slopes, obsidian sharper than any blade of bronze. Here, people lived close to the breath of the earth, and the earth often reminded them who ruled. In those early centuries before Christ, scattered villages clung to the edges of the lakes, Texcoco, Chalco, Xochimilco, each a patch of life in a world still half wild. Farmers shaped floating gardens of reeds and mud. Hunters stalked deer and rabbit in the dry grasslands. Potters and traders followed the tracks between hamlets. They spoke many tongues, but shared the same horizon. Mountains that smoked, waters that rose and fell with the seasons, and stars that turned in rhythms older than memory. Among those settlements, one name would later echo like a lost heartbeat, Quiquilco. It lay to the south, near the slopes of a volcano called Zitle, and in its day, it was the pride of the basin. Its people raised the first true monument of central Mexico, a vast circular pyramid faced with stone, shaped not to pierce the heavens, but to hold them. Around it grew a sea of 20,000 souls, traders, priests, craftsmen, and farmers, whose fields shimmered with maize and amaranth. They worshipped fire and water, sky and fertility, and perhaps believed that their world had achieved balance. But balance is a fragile thing when one lives upon a mountain's breath. The warning came in a season of tremors. The earth moaned beneath their feet, and then, one night, Zitle tore open. A tide of molten stone poured from its flanks, slow but unstoppable, swallowing fields, homes, and temples alike. The air turned red, the lake steamed, the gods went silent. For days, perhaps weeks, the people fled northward, carrying idols and seeds, leading children through a rain of ash. When at last the fire ceased, Quiquilco was gone, buried beneath a desert of rock that would cool only after generations. Those who survived scattered across the valley. Some settled in smaller villages near the lakes. Others wandered toward the northern plains, where the soil was thinner, but the ground was still whole. They brought with them the memory of a drowned city, and an instinct that the land must be read carefully, as one reads a dangerous text. In time, these exiles and their descendants found a place where several valleys converged. A broad plain, framed by low hills and fed by springs that never dried. To the east, a jagged mountain rose like a guardian. To the west, the San Juan River traced a path through the plain. It was not the richest corner of the basin, nor the safest, yet it offered something subtler, a meeting point of trade routes, a foundation firm enough to build upon. Small hamlets took root there, clusters of huts built from clay and reeds, their walls painted in the ochres of the earth. Families tilled narrow plots, planted maize and beans, and gathered obsidian from the nearby hills. In that glassy stone lay both livelihood and danger. It gleamed like water, but cut like divine judgment. Men shaped it into knives, arrowheads, and mirrors polished to a dark brilliance. When they gazed into those mirrors, they saw not their own reflections, but the shimmer of gods watching back. Trade grew slowly along the tracks that crossed the valley. Obsidian was the blood of commerce, carried in baskets to faraway settlements, where it was exchanged for shells from distant coasts, feathers, and salt. The people of this northern plain became known for their skill in working it. Precise, methodical, almost reverent. The glint of the stone caught the eyes of travelers, and little by little more families arrived to join the growing villages. Seasons passed, then generations. The old fear of the volcano faded into story, a tale told by firelight. The new settlers began to raise small temples of earth and wood, modest shrines aligned with the path of the sun. These were not yet pyramids, but they hinted at the desire to connect heaven and soil, a longing that would one day find its answer in stone. Ceremonies were held at dawn and dusk, when the mountains cast long shadows across the plain. Drums echoed against the hills, and the air filled with the scent of burning copal. This gathering of people, fragile and improvised, might have reigned a handful of villages had it not been for the gifts of geography. The valley, though dry, was a crossroads. From the west came traders bearing copper bells and greenstone. From the east, the roots of the Gulf. From the south, survivors of Quiquilco and the richer lands beyond the lakes. What began as refuge became opportunity. By 200 BC, a network of settlements had formed, their fields stretching wider each year. Where once families farmed apart, they now built together. Canals, causeways, terraces. The plain began to pulse with organized labor. Archaeologists would later find the traces of those earliest builders, foundations of adobe, pits of discarded obsidian flakes, fragments of clay figurines depicting women with wide eyes and elaborate headdresses. These were not the idols of empire, but of household devotion, guardians of fertility and hearth. Each gesture of worship was intimate, domestic, and profoundly human. And yet, behind that intimacy, something vast was stirring. The sense that the world itself could be shaped, aligned, made sacred through design. It was in this quiet century before Teotihuacan's birth that the idea of the city began to form, not as architecture, but as revelation. To live together was no longer merely convenient, it was divine. The builders of the early shrines watched the sun rise between the same peaks year after year and began to mark its path with posts, stones, and mounds. They discovered patterns, the same alignment of light that would, generations later, dictate the city's grandest avenue. Faith was turning into geometry. Meanwhile, the population grew beyond the scale of villages. New migrants brought skills, myths, and the ambition of survivors. Some remembered the round pyramid of Quiquilco and dreamt of surpassing it. Others spoke of distant lands where the gods were born from caves and rivers. Such stories blended in the new settlements, giving birth to a shared mythology, one in which the plain itself might be the womb of creation. The 1st century before Christ, the valley had changed. The northern basin, once considered poor and dry, now hummed with life. Canals shimmered in the sun, smoke curled from kilns and hearths. The nights flickered with torchlight. People were no longer fleeing from fire. They were calling it forth. Ritual and labor had merged. To dig, to build, to plant was to serve the gods. In the evenings, when the wind rose from the hills, they would look toward the horizon where Cerro Gordo loomed, the great rounded mountain whose silhouette dominated the plain. It seemed to them a resting god, a sleeping giant whose dreams shaped their fortune. At its base, they left offerings, shells from distant seas, obsidian knives, maize cobs painted with red pigment. A few priests, or visionaries, or madmen, began to say that this was the center of the world, the place where heaven touched the underworld. Others believed that one day a city would stand there, ordered by the stars. The prophecy spread quietly, as all prophecies do. A place once known only for its stones and springs became a destination for pilgrims and traders. They came not just to exchange goods, but to witness the plain where a new order of the cosmos might unfold. No one called it Teotihuacan yet. It was still nameless, or known by names long since lost to time. But the land was already choosing its destiny. Before long, the scattered villages began to fuse. Paths became streets, shrines became temples, fields became neighborhoods. The population, once measured in hundreds, swelled into thousands. From the surrounding valleys, new migrants arrived. Artisans from the west, farmers from the south, stonecutters from the east. They brought languages, crafts, and rival gods, but here they learned to live side by side. Out of diversity came strength, and out of survival came vision. No one could have foreseen the magnitude of what would follow, that from these modest beginnings would rise the greatest city of the ancient Americas, a place the later Nahua would call Teotihuacan, where men become gods. Yet even in its infancy, the valley already seemed touched by that fate. Beneath the soil lay the ashes of Quiquilco. Above it, the shadow of mountains, and between them a people who had learned how to turn disaster into destiny. When dawn came and the first light struck the plain, the hills shone as if lit from within. Farmers looked up from their fields and saw not just sunlight, but a promise that their work, their prayers, their very city would one day reach the sky. The land did not forget the hands that shaped it. By the dawn of the 1st century before Christ, the northern basin had grown restless with purpose. From the scattered villages that clung to the plain emerged something new, a sense of alignment, as though invisible lines were being drawn across the earth. Men began to measure not in steps or fields, but in stars. The ground itself became a map of heaven. No one could have named the first dreamer, the one who stood upon that wide plain and imagined a city laid out in sacred geometry. But the idea must have come suddenly, like a flash of sunlight over the ridge of Cerro Gordo. What if the heavens could be fixed to the soil? What if the home of men could reflect the home of gods? From that audacious thought came the plan that would birth a civilization. The first markers appeared, posts driven deep into the ground, their shadows charted by the sun. By firelight, the planners traced the angles with cords and pigments, mapping where temples would rise, where avenues would run, where water would flow. The San Juan River was forced to bend to their design, redirected so that its current followed the same celestial rhythm as the stars above. The act was both engineering and prayer, a reshaping of nature to mirror the divine order. At the center of the plain stretched a broad causeway, straight as a god's decree, its axis tilted slightly from true north, 15.5 degrees to the east. It was no accident. That slant followed the sunset on the days that divided the sacred calendar, 260 days apart. To later generations, this would be known as the Avenue of the Dead. To its builders, it was the spine of the cosmos. Along this path, rose the first Great Pyramid, a mountain built by human will. Beneath it, engineers carved a man-made cave, hollowing the earth into 4 chambers that met at a single heart. In their myth, creation began in such a place, a dark womb from which light first emerged. Now that story took form in stone. They heaped layer upon layer of earth, lime and gravel, faced it with mud brick and plaster, and raised it higher than any structure yet known in the Americas. When the sun struck its summit, the mountain gleamed as if the dawn itself had chosen to dwell there. Around this sacred core, neighborhoods began to form. The first were humble, reed huts, storage pits, workshops. But even these followed the rhythm of the grid. Streets ran straight, walls met at perfect angles. It was a city not grown, but designed. The people who built it believed themselves part of an order greater than kings or armies. Each brick, each offering, each drop of sweat was a form of worship. Artisans decorated the plastered walls with bright pigments, red for the sun, blue for rain, green for fertility. In courtyards, they set up small shrines of firestone where incense curled into the morning air. At night, the stars appeared to gather over the unfinished pyramid, as if keeping watch over what was being born. The city's heart was not merely a temple, but a symbol, a cosmic mountain linking underworld and sky. Those who worked on its slopes carried stones as though bearing prayers. Offerings were buried at each layer: obsidian blades, shells from distant seas, fragments of jade, the bones of sacrificed animals, and sometimes of men. They were not mere victims. They were fuel for creation, companions to the gods whose forms were being raised above them. It is said that no single ruler commanded this. Power, at least in those early generations, belonged to a council of lineages, priests and architects bound by faith rather than blood. What united them was vision, that human order could be made eternal if it were built in the image of the heavens. The Pyramid of the Sun, as it would later be called, was the proof of that vision. The population swelled. The migrants who had once wandered after the fall of Quiquilco found stability here. Fields spread across the valley. Canals carried water to the edges of the plain. Farmers, artisans, merchants all found their place within the unfolding design. Smoke from thousands of hearths rose into the air, merging into a haze that seemed to sanctify the skyline. With each passing decade, the city's boundaries advanced. New plazas and platforms appeared, their alignments echoing the first. Smaller temples ringed the great avenue like constellations around a central star. To an outsider, it might have seemed as though the land itself had been enchanted, compelled into harmony. Travelers arriving from the south spoke of a miracle, a settlement so ordered that its very streets told the story of time. At its heart, priests tended fires that never went out. They watched the heavens from platforms at night, marking the cycles of Venus and the sun. When the two met in their sacred conjunctions, festivals filled the city, dances, offerings, and songs to summon rain and renewal. The scent of burning copal drifted for miles, drawing pilgrims from beyond the valley. They came from the Gulf lowlands and the highlands of Oaxaca, from the distant western valleys where turquoise and copper were mined. Some brought tribute, others came to stay. With them arrived foreign gods, foreign crafts, and foreign blood. But in Teotihuacan, though that name had not yet been spoken, all were absorbed into the greater design. The city was a living mandala, and everyone within it a moving part. By the turn of the era, the sacred avenue stretched more than 2 miles. It ended at the foot of Cerro Gordo, where the first builders had once seen their mountain of prophecy. There, another pyramid began to rise, smaller but no less deliberate. It was oriented to the same stars, its foundation laid with ceremony and blood. The two pyramids faced one another like twin flames, one for the sun's ascent, one for its descent, mirroring the dual forces of life and death that ruled the Mesoamerican cosmos. What might have seemed to later ages as mere architecture was, to its creators, the body of the universe. Every measurement echoed their sacred numbers: 260 days in the calendar, 52 years in the solar cycle. Even the distances between temples carried hidden meaning. They were not building a city, they were sculpting time. There is evidence that during this first great phase, no palace stood apart from the temples. The city was a collective act, not yet divided by privilege or wealth. The same hands that made bricks also made offerings. The same people who raised walls painted them with divine imagery. Power lay not in a throne, but in the idea that the city itself was divine. When night fell over the valley, the pyramids caught the last fire of the setting sun. From the surrounding plains, the glow looked like a beacon to the heavens, or perhaps a signal from the gods themselves. The people called their home many names, none of which survive, but the later Nahua would remember it as Teotihuacan, the place where men become gods. That name, though born centuries later, feels inevitable, as though it had always been waiting beneath the dust. By 50 AD, tens of thousands lived within the ordered grid. Marketplaces filled with traders selling obsidian blades, pottery, and woven cotton. Children played among the causeways. Priests lit torches at the base of the pyramid as the first stars appeared. There was peace in the valley and purpose in every act. Still, beneath that harmony, something larger was taking shape. The ambition of empire disguised as faith. To control the sacred calendar was to control time itself. To master the flow of water and fire was to claim the powers of creation. The builders may not have sought conquest, but their city's perfection invited imitation and fear. When the sun rose over the valley, its light struck directly upon the Great Pyramid, setting it aflame in gold. Farmers in distant fields could see that glimmer and knew that somewhere beyond the hills, the gods were being born again each morning. And so they came, pilgrims, refugees, dreamers, drawn to the city whose streets aligned with the stars. In that convergence of faith and geometry, Teotihuacan was founded, not as a mere settlement, but as a covenant between mankind and the cosmos. The city's planners had turned the sky into a blueprint, and from that blueprint, they summoned a civilization that would outlast its builders, its language, even its name. The mountain they made of their own hands would stand for 2,000 years, long after the men who built it had turned to dust. And from its summit, the world itself seemed remade. By the 1st century after Christ, the plain of Teotihuacan thundered with labor. Stone echoed against stone, and the air shimmered with dust and song. The city that had begun as a sacred alignment was becoming something far greater, a statement of faith made visible from the mountains. From dawn until nightfall, thousands of workers climbed the slopes of the half-built pyramid, hauling baskets of rubble and lime, their chants timed to the rhythm of drums. Each step upward was a prayer. The Great Pyramid of the Sun rose fastest of all. It dominated the valley like a second mountain, dwarfing the smaller mounds around it. From its summit, one could see the entire basin, the lakes in the south, the volcanic chain to the west. the faint shimmer of smoke from distant villages. The builders must have known they were creating a monument not only for their gods, but for all who would come after. No ruler's name would ever be carved upon it. The power it represented was older and deeper than any crown. At the foot of the pyramid, broad plazas filled with people during festivals. Pilgrims arrived bearing offerings of maize, feathers, and incense. Traders followed, selling obsidian blades and painted pottery. The sound of flutes drifted across the avenue, while priests in white robes climbed the steps, carrying braziers that trailed blue smoke. From below, the flames looked like stars descending to meet the earth. These were years of furious creation. The Avenue of the Dead stretched north to south in austere precision, flanked by temples and platforms still half buried in scaffolding. Canals and drains traced geometric lines through the neighborhoods. What had once been a collection of villages now pulsed as a single organism, fed by the river that had been tamed to flow through its heart. In that act, to bend a river, to force it to follow the stars, lay the city's defining spirit. Discipline and faith joined as one. Artisans shaped clay, stone, and pigment into a language of symbols. The gods of Teotihuacan began to acquire faces, some benevolent, some terrifying, all charged with meaning. In frescoes painted across the walls of temples, serpents curled through clouds, jaguars drank from flowing streams, and masked figures offered their hearts to the sky. Water, fire, and fertility wove together into a single cycle of renewal. Each image was less decoration than theology. The most potent figure of this new pantheon was the storm god, master of rain and lightning. His visage appeared on vessels and braziers, eyes round as the sun, mouth fanged like thunderclouds. Fire accompanied him always. Even in the temples dedicated to water, flames burned in his honor. This paradox, fire to summon rain, spoke of the city's understanding of balance, of destruction as the price of life. In the workshops scattered through the neighborhoods, obsidian workers crafted knives so sharp they could part a single hair. Others polished the black stone into mirrors for divination, gazing into their dark surfaces until visions rose. Bone carvers, shell inlayers, and feather workers joined them, turning humble materials into objects of splendor. The artisans of Teotihuacan did not work in anonymity. Their craft was sacred. A painted vessel or a carved mask was an offering as worthy as blood. Everywhere, building continued. New platforms climbed skyward. Temples of adobe were faced with stone and plaster, their surfaces gleaming under the sun. The plaza before the Great Pyramid became the city's ceremonial core, a stage for the rituals that bound its people together. When festivals came, tens of thousands gathered there, arrayed in bright cottons and feathered cloaks. The smell of roasted maize mingled with the sweetness of copal. At sunset, priests began the rites. They kindled sacred fires and scattered flowers along the causeway. Musicians beat drums that echoed off the mountains. From the steps above, the high priests called for silence, then raised their blades of obsidian. A cry rose from the crowd, not fear, but devotion. In that moment, the city became a single body, and the blood that spilled on the stone was its heartbeat. To the modern mind, these ceremonies might seem cruel, yet to the people of Teotihuacan, sacrifice was creation renewed. Just as their ancestors had seen the world remade by fire, so too did they believe the gods required sustenance to keep the sun alive. Death was not an ending, but a trade, a gift to ensure the turning of seasons. As the decades passed, the city grew beyond its founder's imagination. The original grid expanded. Apartment compounds replaced simple huts. Each compound enclosed a courtyard, a well, and a small shrine. Families lived and worked together, their daily tasks woven into the rhythm of worship. A potter might leave an offering before firing his kiln. A farmer might burn incense before opening the irrigation gate. Life was an unbroken ritual. The elite, though not yet distant from the rest, began to distinguish themselves through display. They commissioned murals filled with symbols of power: jaguars, serpents, butterflies, creatures that crossed boundaries between worlds. Some compounds became centers of administration or trade. Others housed foreign merchants who had come to settle under Teotihuacan's protection. The city's population likely exceeded 50,000 souls, a scale unimaginable to the villages of the past. The Pyramid of the Sun, completed in these years, stood as a visible covenant between heaven and earth. At its summit burned the eternal flame, tended day and night by the priesthood. When the sun rose behind Cerro Gordo, the first rays crowned the pyramid's top before touching any other part of the valley. The city was alive in that light, its people awakening to the rhythm of the cosmos they had built into their streets. Not far from the main pyramid, smaller temples honored other aspects of the divine: fire, fertility, wind, and war. Each was aligned to the same celestial pattern. Nothing was arbitrary. Even the courtyards of humble homes mirrored the great plazas in miniature. Teotihuacan was not simply a city where gods were worshipped. It was a city designed for gods to inhabit. In time, the fame of this new metropolis spread across Mesoamerica. Travelers from Oaxaca and the Gulf Coast carried tales of its vast pyramid, its order, its wealth. They spoke of a people who had learned to command water, who built mountains out of dust. For those who heard these stories, Teotihuacan became less a place than an idea, proof that divine order could be achieved on earth. Among its inhabitants, faith was no longer confined to temples. It breathed through every aspect of their world. The farmers who sowed their fields timed their planting by the city's astronomers. The potters mixed their clay with water, blessed in ritual. Even the act of walking the Avenue of the Dead, a path of perfect symmetry, was a pilgrimage from the living to the sacred. And yet, beneath that harmony, there was ambition. The priests spoke often of expansion, of spreading their cosmic balance beyond the valley. The wealth of trade flowed steadily through the markets: obsidian blades, painted ceramics, textiles, and food. Surpluses fed armies of builders who, when not laboring on temples, trained as soldiers. Power and piety were growing intertwined. When night descended, the city glowed with countless fires. The sound of chanting rose from every courtyard. From above, it must have looked as though the stars had fallen to earth, a reflection of the heavens upon the soil. Perhaps that was always the intention. By the middle of the 2nd century, Teotihuacan had become not just the heart of the valley, but of an entire world. Its pyramids drew pilgrims like magnets. Its artisans' works traveled hundreds of miles. The city's population approached 100,000, and yet its streets remained ordered, its rituals precise. This harmony, born of shared faith and collective labor, was its greatest strength. But perfection has a cost. The scale of the city demanded constant maintenance, and its priesthood grew powerful in both spirit and rule. The next generation would inherit a city of gods and begin to question who, among mortals, held their favor. For now, the people of Teotihuacan lived as if eternity had already begun. Each morning, the sun rose over the Pyramid of the Sun, and the valley shimmered in gold. The mountain of men had become the mountain of gods, and the city beneath it was alive with devotion, vast, ordered, and radiant, a beacon of faith that would soon cast its light far beyond its valley. By the middle of the 2nd century, Teotihuacan had reached a scale no one could have foreseen. Its great avenues stretched for miles, its pyramids pierced the horizon, and its markets drew strangers from every corner of the land. Yet for all its order and beauty, something restless stirred beneath the symmetry, a hunger not just for harmony, but for dominion. The northern end of the city became the stage for this transformation. There, where the Avenue of the Dead met the rising slopes of Cerro Gordo, the builders began another vast pyramid. Its foundation aligned with the same celestial rhythm as its southern twin, but its purpose was darker, more intimate with the powers of death and rebirth. The people would call it the Pyramid of the Moon. To those who watched its construction, it must have seemed as though the mountain itself were giving birth. Layer upon layer rose over decades, each addition consecrated with offerings and blood. Excavations centuries later would reveal the truth. Beneath its steps lay the remains of sacrificed warriors, bound and buried beside jaguars, eagles, and wolves. These were not victims of cruelty, but envoys to the gods, sent to guard the temple's heart. Their bones, arranged with weapons and jewels, tell of a city that had begun to see warfare not merely as necessity, but as ritual. In the shadow of a new pyramid, processions wound through the plaza, priests in plumed headdresses, drummers keeping the pace of the heart, dancers painted in red and black. At the height of each ceremony, the high priest stood upon the platform, arms raised toward Cerro Gordo. The mountain loomed behind him like a colossal effigy of the goddess herself, a presence both fertile and merciless. To the faithful, the pyramid and mountain were one, the body of a deity sleeping beneath the valley's sky. The cult that gathered around this shrine reshaped Teotihuacan's soul. Its rituals were not confined to prayer or offering. They demanded spectacle, sacrifice, and submission. Each new layer of the pyramid was sealed with a rite of renewal. Warriors captured in battle, sometimes from faraway lands, were led in chains to the summit. There they met the obsidian knife beneath the open sky. Their blood darkened the steps, an offering meant to strengthen the city and its gods alike. This fusion of faith and might gave rise to a new order, one in which priests and generals shared power. The two were no longer distinct. A man could pray with one hand and wield a spear with the other. In murals, deities began to appear clad in armor, their faces half hidden by masks of serpents and fire. The same city that had once built pyramids to mirror the heavens now built them to proclaim authority on earth. Yet even amid this growing power, the artistry of Teotihuacan reached sublime heights. Painters covered walls with brilliant scenes, flowing rivers of turquoise, feathered serpents coiling through clouds, and the image of a goddess whose hands poured streams of water that blossomed into flowers. Later generations would call her the Great Goddess, patroness of fertility, abundance, and transformation. In her murals, she reigns at the center of creation, crowned by a headdress of jade and birds. But beneath her beauty lies ambiguity. She gives life, yet demands sacrifice. Through her, the people came to see themselves as part of an endless cycle: destruction, feeding creation; death, nurturing birth. The festivals held in her honor grew more elaborate each year. Entire districts joined in the celebrations, their courtyards strewn with petals and maize. Musicians played conch shells and drums, while dancers wearing butterfly wings whirled beneath banners of red and gold. The air thickened with incense and the scent of agave drink, For a few days, the city dissolved into ecstasy, its citizens certain they were walking among gods. As faith deepened, so did the city's reach. Teotihuacan's armies began to move beyond the valley, their obsidian-tipped weapons glinting in the sun. They marched along ancient trade routes, seizing control of mountain passes and river crossings. The goal was not mere plunder, but protection, to secure the flow of tribute and goods that sustained the metropolis. Outposts appeared in distant regions, marked by the same talud tablero style of construction, unmistakable even to foreign eyes. Wherever that geometry spread, so did Teotihuacan's influence. Inside the city, prosperity turned monumental. The once humble compounds evolved into sprawling complexes, each housing extended families and their workshops. Merchants from Oaxaca, Veracruz, and the Maya lowlands settled in distinct quarters, bringing their languages and gods with them. Archaeologists would one day call these barrios neighborhoods bound by culture but united under Teotihuacan's order. The presence of these foreigners tells a story of ambition and allure. They were not slaves or exiles, but participants in the city's destiny. Teotihuacan had become more than a home. It was a magnet, a center of gravity pulling the peoples of Mesoamerica into its orbit. In its plazas, one could hear dozens of dialects. Markets overflowed with obsidian blades, cotton textiles, shells, cacao, and copper. Traders came seeking wealth, but many stayed for the security of a city so vast that even the mountains seemed to bow before it. At the southern end of the Avenue of the Dead, a new structure began to rise. The Ciudadela, a vast rectangular compound enclosing a temple unlike any other. Its facade erupted with sculpted serpents, each feathered and crowned, their eyes carved in stone as if caught mid-flight. Between them, other faces emerged, some human, some divine, all fierce. Beneath this temple lay a chamber lined with offerings, jade, shells, mirrors, and the remains of more than 200 warriors. This was the temple of the feathered serpent, and it marked the culmination of a new ideology. Where the pyramid of the sun symbolized creation and light, this temple spoke of transformation, the merging of divine and mortal, heaven and earth. The feathered serpent, later known as Quetzalcoatl, embodied both. To follow his path was to ascend through knowledge and sacrifice, to shed the human form and take on the divine. The temple's dedication was an event the valley would never forget. Drums thundered across the plain, horns echoed from the hills. Processions filled the Avenue of the Dead as thousands gathered to witness the consecration. From balconies and rooftops, they watched as priests in serpent masks ascended the stairs, each carrying a torch. When the last reached the summit, the fires ignited in unison, turning the night into day. The glow reflected off the obsidian walls, bathing the crowd in crimson light. In that moment, the city seemed to breathe as one being, a vast living god forged from stone and flame. Through such ceremonies, Teotihuacan bound its people to a shared destiny. The authority of its priests was absolute, yet it rested not on tyranny, but on belief. To defy the rituals was to defy the order of the cosmos itself. Still, this devotion had a cost. Human life became the city's most sacred currency. The higher the pyramid, the deeper its foundations of bone. By the middle of the 3rd century, Teotihuacan's reach extended far beyond the valley. Its armies, merchants, and emissaries appeared in lands hundreds of miles away. In Maya inscriptions from the east, symbols began to mimic those of the highland metropolis, proof that its power had crossed mountains and jungles alike. The city had become a mirror, held up to the world, and the world could not look away. At dusk, when the last light struck the pyramid of the moon, its stone face turned red, as though remembering the blood once spilled upon it. Below, the city glowed with thousands of hearths, each one a reflection of the fires burning atop the temples. Between heaven and earth, between faith and fear, Teotihuacan found its balance. It was no longer merely the place where men become gods. It was where gods demanded men become worthy of them. Once, it was only a city. By the 3rd century, Teotihuacan had become a world unto itself. It had become an argument in stone, that the divine could be measured, built, and commanded. Every corner of its immense grid pulsed with purpose. From the highest temple to the humblest courtyard, order reigned. Smoke from 1,000 braziers curled into the sky, as if the earth itself exhaled in worship. And at the heart of it all, gleaming with painted scales and carved fangs, stood the temple of the feathered serpent. No monument better captured the city's ambition. Its facade blazed with images of gods bursting from waves of serpents, plumed, coiling, and crowned. Between their jaws, seashells were carved in relief, a language of water and fertility carved into stone. Yet behind that beauty lay the shadow of power. Beneath the temple's stairway, the builders sealed away more than 200 human bodies, buried in careful order, each one armed as a warrior. Some were foreign captives, others chosen men of Teotihuacan itself. They had become guardians of the temple's soul, proof that faith and conquest were now indistinguishable. When the ceremonies of dedication began, the entire city must have shaken with sound. Drums rolled like thunder. Shell trumpets roared from the plazas. Processions of priests moved in unison, their cloaks trailing feathers, their faces painted with jade and blood. From the terraces, citizens watched as the torches climbed the pyramid. At the summit, flames erupted into the night, reflected in canals below. The temple became a beacon, its light reaching beyond the valley, a signal of dominion to the world outside. The feathered serpent himself, known later as Quetzalcoatl, emerged from these rituals not merely as a god of wind and wisdom, but as a symbol of rulership. To ascend through him was to claim both divine favor and earthly right. His temple stood within the Ciudadela, a vast walled precinct large enough to hold tens of thousands. Here, the city's rulers staged spectacles that were both political and cosmic. Each ceremony reaffirmed the same truth. Teotihuacan was the center of creation, and those who governed it did so by celestial mandate. Power, once collective and sacred, began to crystallize into hierarchy. Archaeologists would later find no singular throne, yet authority was everywhere visible, in the planned streets, in the regulated markets, in the murals that told of divine kingship without ever naming a king. Perhaps that was the secret of Teotihuacan's rule. No face to challenge, no ruler to overthrow. The city itself was the sovereign. Beyond its walls, Teotihuacan's influence unfurled like a tide. Traders followed the obsidian routes deep into the highlands and lowlands, carrying not only goods, but symbols. The distinctive talud tablero architecture began to appear in distant cities, at Caminaljuyu, at Monte Alban, even among the Maya far to the east. Wherever its lines and angles appeared, they spoke of alliance, of tribute, or of fear. The wealth of the city was immense. Obsidian flowed from the nearby mines of Pachuca, its rare green hue prized across Mesoamerica. Craftsmen shaped it into knives, mirrors, and arrowheads so fine that kings of distant lands paid dearly for them. In return came shells from tropical coasts, cacao, feathers of the quetzal, copper bells, and jaguar pelts. markets filled with color and clamor. Amid the smell of roasting maize and burning incense, merchants bargained in dozens of tongues. The pulse of trade was steady and loud, like the beating of a vast heart. In this golden age, Teotihuacan became a city of thresholds, between worlds, between peoples, between faith and empire. Foreign quarters thrived within its grid. Oaxacans carved their gods beside Teotihuacan's deities. Mayan scribes etched glyphs on imported ceramics. Gulf Coast traders brought their humid songs to the dry valley air. In every compound, difference became devotion. The empire of the feathered serpent was not held by sword alone, but by absorption. Yet even as diversity enriched the city, it also demanded control. The rulers, or council, or priestly elite, whatever name they bore, ensured that every aspect of life moved in rhythm with the state religion. Festivals were scheduled with astronomical precision. The sacred fires were fed at appointed hours. The measure of time itself was decided in the temple precincts. By uniting heaven's cycles with civic life, the leaders bound their subjects to a single, inescapable order. The arts reflected this unity of purpose. Mural painters worked under strict symbolism: serpents for rulership, butterflies for rebirth, water for life's renewal, fire for sacrifice. Masks of obsidian and jade adorned the dead. Sculptors carved deities with human faces and humans with divine ones, erasing the line between them. The result was a civilization in which religion was not a separate sphere, but the substance of existence. Military strength sustained this order. Behind the rituals and festivals marched trained legions, warriors clothed in jaguar skins and eagle feathers, their shields painted with spirals of fire. They carried obsidian-tipped spears and atlatls, weapons of remarkable precision. Their purpose was as much ceremonial as strategic. Every campaign was a reenactment of cosmic struggle, a replay of the gods' own wars for balance. When they conquered, they brought back captives for sacrifice. When they traded, they spread the city's iconography like scripture. Far beyond the valley, whispers of Teotihuacan's power grew. In the jungles of the Maya lowlands, rulers began to adorn themselves with symbols borrowed from the feathered serpent's cult. On stelae carved hundreds of miles away, warriors appeared in Teotihuacan armor. Round shields, tasseled headdresses, and the goggles of the storm god. In 378 AD, a Teotihuacano general would even march into the city of Tikal, overthrow its king, and install a new dynasty aligned with the northern metropolis. But that tale belonged to the next century. For now, the seeds of empire had already been sown. At home, the people felt the benefits of this expansion. Grain flowed freely into the markets. Artisans thrived under patronage. Roads were kept clear and safe by soldiers and priests alike. For the common citizen, the empire was less visible conquest than visible abundance. Their loyalty was rewarded with order, their faith with spectacle. Still, in the murals of the later 3rd century, a subtle shift can be felt. The bright blues and greens of fertility gave way to deeper reds and blacks. The storm god's eyes became more frequent. The feathered serpent's smile grew sharper. Power had found permanence, and permanence in human hands always casts a shadow. By 300 AD, Teotihuacan was the most populous city in the Western Hemisphere. Perhaps 120,000 souls lived within its walls. Its pyramids glittered with paint and mica. At night, the fires of 100,000 hearths lit the sky in a golden haze. Seen from afar, it must have looked like a constellation brought down to earth. A celestial city inhabited by mortals who had convinced themselves they were gods. Yet no empire, however divine it believes itself, escapes the weight of its own splendor. The very system that unified Teotihuacan began to strain under its magnitude. The priests demanded ever larger sacrifices to maintain cosmic order. The armies marched farther to keep the goods flowing. Faith had built the city, but ambition now sustained it. Still, to those who lived in its glow, it seemed eternal. The pyramid of the sun blazed each morning. The pyramid of the moon caught the dying light each evening. Between them stretched the avenue of the dead, straight, solemn, and magnificent. Along its length, processions passed in endless rhythm. Priests, soldiers, musicians, and citizens carrying flowers, fire, and blood. For 100 years, Teotihuacan stood unchallenged, a miracle of human will. Its builders had turned faith into architecture, architecture into empire. But empires, even those built to mirror the stars, must answer to time. In the silence between festivals, the first tremors of change began to stir, unnoticed by those who believed their city eternal. The gods had been made visible. Soon they would begin to speak. What had begun as a city confined to its basin now reached past the mountains that once enclosed it. The city's influence flowed outward like the rivers it had once tamed, crossing mountains, jungles, and deserts. Obsidian, gold, feathers, and faith all bore its mark. To outsiders it seemed less a city than a force of nature, silent and inexorable. Wherever its merchants walked, its gods followed. This was the age of expansion, not through open conquest alone, but through something subtler and more enduring. The priests called it the web of the feathered serpent, a design stretching across the land. Its strands were roads, alliances, marriages, and trade agreements, each connecting distant peoples to the city at the heart of the world. Caravans departed through every gate of Teotihuacan. Some wound south toward Oaxaca, laden with obsidian blades that glittered like black fire. Others traveled east into the humid forests of the Maya, their packs filled with pottery and textiles. Along the Pacific coast, ships carved from caber wood carried merchants and soldiers alike. The routes were long and perilous, yet they brought home more than goods. They returned with stories, captives, and new symbols for the temples. The city's wealth rested upon its mastery of obsidian. The quarries near Pachuca yielded the rare green variety, translucent as water and sharper than any bronze. It was the iron of its age, the edge that cut both food and flesh, the mirror that reflected the will of the gods. From the workshops along the Avenue of the Dead, artisans shaped the stone into weapons and ornaments that glimmered in the sun. These tools became the currency of empire. Whoever controlled obsidian controlled war itself. Foreign lords learned quickly that peace with Teotihuacan was more profitable than resistance. Envoys from distant cities arrived bearing tribute: shells, cacao, jaguar skins, and bright feathers of the quetzal. Some came as guests, others as hostages. All left changed. Murals from faraway lands began to depict warriors in the dress of Teotihuacan, faces hidden behind the goggled masks of the storm god, shields painted with serpents and lightning. Even the shapes of their temples echoed the city's architecture. The world was beginning to speak in Teotihuacan's language. Still, the expansion was not entirely peaceful. Along the Gulf Coast and into the highlands of Guatemala, Teotihuacan's soldiers appeared, disciplined, silent, and swift. They wore padded armor painted in red and carried atlatls carved with divine motifs. Their ranks moved with ritual precision, each campaign undertaken as a sacred act. When a city resisted, its temples were not merely destroyed, they were remade, rededicated to Teotihuacan's gods. The conquerors did not seek annihilation, but conversion. It was during this time that the Entrada occurred, the most dramatic projection of Teotihuacan's power ever recorded. In 378 AD, deep in the jungles of the Maya world, a general bearing the name Fireborn led his warriors into the city of Tikal. The event is carved upon Maya stele, where its date is given with unearthly precision. The invaders toppled the reigning king and installed a new ruler loyal to the metropolis in the highlands. Whether this act was conquest or alliance has long been debated, but the result was unmistakable. Teotihuacan's reach had touched the farthest forests of the east. From that moment onward, Maya rulers adopted the symbols of the valley. They wore headdresses shaped like serpents, carried round shields, and claimed descent from the great city where men became gods. Some even reshaped their capitals to mimic its geometry. The influence was not fleeting. For centuries, echoes of Teotihuacan would linger in their art, their warfare, and their concept of divine kingship. Back home, the prosperity born of this network transformed the metropolis. The markets swelled with exotic goods. Shell jewelry from the coasts jingled in the courtyards. Spices and resins perfumed the air. Feathers of every color adorned the garments of priests and dancers. In workshops, artisans experimented with new materials, turquoise from the north, jade from the south, creating objects that fused styles from across Mesoamerica. The city had become not only the center of trade, but the crucible of culture itself. Its rulers maintained this vast network with a precision that mirrored their architecture. Colonies and enclaves were founded near key resources: obsidian mines, fertile valleys, river crossings. Each was designed in miniature to resemble the mother city. The same grid, the same talud tablero walls, the same orientation to the stars. These outposts served as both trading stations and symbols of allegiance. To live within their walls was to dwell under the gaze of Teotihuacan. Messengers moved constantly along the roads, carrying information and orders. They were swift, tireless men trained to cover immense distances. In their pouches, they bore carved tablets, tokens of jade, or painted scrolls that conveyed the city's will. Through them, Teotihuacan's influence remained alive even in lands where its soldiers never marched. But every empire built on faith must balance belief with fear. The priests who directed this vast expansion justified it as divine necessity. The world, they said, was ordered only so long as Teotihuacan maintained harmony between sky and earth. To fail in that duty would invite chaos. Tribute was therefore not greed, but obligation. Conquest, not ambition, but sacrifice on a cosmic scale. Within the city, this ideology deepened the power of the ruling class. The feathered serpent, god of wind, wisdom, and rebirth, became the emblem of the state. His likeness adorned banners and shields, and his temple served as both shrine and fortress. Beneath its terraces, soldiers trained, their footsteps echoing through chambers that had once housed the dead. In murals, the serpent's coils encircled the world, binding it in luminous order. The citizens lived within that embrace, both proud and bound. Apartment compounds continued to multiply, housing artisans, merchants, and foreign residents. In the evenings, smoke rose from hundreds of kitchens, mingling with the incense of distant temples. From above, the city resembled a mosaic, squares of red clay and white plaster, divided by the dark ribbons of streets and canals. Its population may have exceeded 150,000 souls, each one a living part of the greater design. Not all were content with their place in it. The influx of wealth created quiet divisions. Some compounds thrived, their walls painted in brilliant pigments and lined with imported goods. Others fell into shadow. The gulf between the priestly elite and the laboring poor widened, though no one yet dared to name it. Outwardly, harmony endured. The festivals still dazzled, the markets still roared, the temples still gleamed beneath the sun. But in the silence between drums, a tension began to hum, faint, persistent, and prophetic. Even so, the 4th century remained Teotihuacan's zenith. Its culture radiated across Mesoamerica like heat from a forge. In distant cities, local kings measured their worth against its grandeur. Some sent their heirs to study its rituals. Others sent their daughters to marry into its lineages. To be allied with Teotihuacan was to borrow legitimacy from the gods themselves. As twilight fell over the valley, the pyramids glowed with the last light of day. From the terraces of the Feathered Serpent's temple, one could look north to the Pyramid of the Moon and south to the Pyramid of the Sun, the twin anchors of heaven and earth. Between them stretched a city that seemed to defy mortality. The wind carried the distant sound of flutes, the rustle of banners, and the murmur of countless prayers. No one could yet imagine that the same roads carrying wealth and tribute would one day bring ruin. For now, the empire stood untouched, its faith unchallenged, its power unquestioned. The web of the Feathered Serpent held firm, bright, intricate, and unbroken. And from its center, Teotihuacan watched the world move according to its design. Morning in Teotihuacan began with a low hum, the strike of hammers, the grinding of maize, the hiss of fire. Smoke curled upward from thousands of hearths, spreading a pale veil across the valley. The city seemed infinite, its avenues unfolding like a labyrinth of symmetry. No palace stood above the rest, no king's image looked down from stone. The power that ruled this metropolis hid behind its walls and rituals, a presence felt rather than seen. Authority in Teotihuacan was an invisible art. It spoke through order instead of speech, through rhythm instead of decree. The city itself was its emblem, a structure so precise that it made human governance appear divine. Those who presided over this perfection left no monuments to themselves, perhaps because none dared compete with the monuments of the gods. Power was collective, cloaked in ceremony, and diffused across the sacred grid like breath through lungs. Within that grid, life was intensely communal. Across the plains stretched walled compounds the size of small villages, each enclosing its own courtyards, altars, and workshops. Behind every gateway lay a world with its own customs, crafts, and deities. Clay lamps glowed beside household shrines. Murals shimmered with the colors of rain and blood. Incense mingled with the scent of roasting maize. These were not mere homes, but miniature cities, self-contained reflections of the greater whole. Artisans lived and worked side by side, their tools and prayers sharing the same space. Obsidian workers chipped black glass into knives that caught the sun like lightning. Potters spun vessels etched with images of water and flame. The rhythm of their labor was devotional. To shape an object was to reaffirm creation itself. Nothing was made that did not hold meaning. Each compound had its own hierarchy, elders, priests, craftmasters, all bound by the quiet authority of the temples. The council that governed Teotihuacan drew power from these networks of families and guilds. Decisions were made in ritual spaces, not thrones. The absence of a monarch did not mean absence of rule. It meant control dispersed through ritual, made sacred by distance and mystery. Among the many gods painted on walls and carved into stone, one figure rose above all others. The great goddess of Teotihuacan, radiant and unblinking, became the heart of devotion. In murals she poured streams of water that turned into flowers and butterflies. Her arms spread wide over the city. Her headdress blossomed with owls and birds. She was the nurturer and the storm, the rain that fed the fields and the flood that swept them away. Her cult bound the city's identity together: abundance, order, endurance. Neighborhoods honored her with offerings of maize, shells, and feathers. At dawn, women carried bowls of water to her altars, sprinkling the courtyards as a plea for fertility. In the murals of Tepantitla, she appears surrounded by green abundance, yet her eyes remain solemn, eternal. To her worshippers, she was both mercy and warning. Prosperity could vanish as swiftly as it bloomed. The variety of life within the city was astonishing. Walk a few streets in any direction, and the language shifted, the faces changed. Immigrant quarters dotted the metropolis like constellations: Zapotec traders from Oaxaca, Maya scribes from the jungles to the east, Totonac merchants from the Gulf. They built their own temples within Teotihuacan's grid, adorning them with gods from their homelands. Yet all were reimagined in the city's style. Even their dead were buried according to local rites, but beneath murals painted with Teotihuacan's colors. Unity was enforced not by sword, but by design. Markets were the lungs of this vast organism. Under rows of canopies, the hum of barter rose like steady music. Obsidian blades gleamed beside cacao beans and jaguar pelts. Copper bells jingled in the hands of traders. Storytellers called out news from distant lands. The smell of burning copal mixed with the sweetness of fruit and the tang of sweat. It was there, among the noise and dust, that Teotihuacan's diversity came alive. Beyond the bustle, priests and administrators recorded tribute, tracked inventories, and maintained the ritual calendar that structured every aspect of life. The cycles of work and worship, planting and harvest, birth and death, all were synchronized to the movement of the stars. Time itself belonged to the city. Evenings in Teotihuacan revealed a different beauty. As the sun fell behind the mountains, the pyramids caught the last light and turned molten gold. Courtyards flickered with torches, chant rose from doorways, drums echoed like distant thunder. From above, the city glowed, a grid of flame and shadow, ordered and alive. To an observer standing on the pyramid of the moon, it must have seemed as though the stars had descended to dwell among men. Yet this harmony was not without strain. The larger the city grew, the more fragile its balance became. Feeding so many mouths required tribute from faraway lands. Managing so many districts demanded an intricate bureaucracy. Droughts in the surrounding valleys pressed the grain stores thin. To restore equilibrium, the priests turned to ritual. The sacrifices grew larger, the festivals longer, the demands on artisans heavier. What had begun as faith now served as maintenance. The machinery of devotion grinding on to sustain the machinery of survival. Within the compounds, unease stirred. Artisans grumbled about shortages of materials. Merchants whispered of taxes raised in the name of the gods. Some wondered aloud whether the priests prayed for rain or for control. But the avenues gave no space for dissent. The city's very design seemed to enforce obedience. Straight lines, right angles, and walls painted with eyes that never closed. Even in its disquiet, Teotihuacan remained unmatched in splendor. The murals of this period reached their height, fluid, dreamlike compositions of color and movement. In them, priests and deities merged. Humans floated in rivers of water and sky. The painters no longer distinguished between myth and memory. everything sacred and mundane blended into one vision. Foreign visitors described the city as overwhelming, a place where every surface bore meaning. The Pyramid of the Sun gleamed with mica under the noon light. The Pyramid of the Moon loomed against Cerro Gordo, its terraces streaked with the shadows of the past. The Avenue of the Dead, lined with altars and courtyards, seemed to lead directly into eternity. To stand there was to feel one's own life shrink beside the vastness of divine architecture. Inside those monumental walls, people lived ordinary joys. Children splashed in courtyards after the rains. Lovers painted each other's faces with crushed pigments. Elders told stories of Quiquilco's fall and the ancestors who had turned fire into fortune. For them, the city was not just stone and ritual. It was home. Its perfection was not tyranny, but comfort, an assurance that the world had shape and purpose. Still, perfection carries its own decay. The very system that gave Teotihuacan stability was beginning to harden into immobility. Tradition weighed as heavily as the stones of its pyramids. Innovation slowed. Ritual replaced imagination. The people continued to honor the great goddess, to walk in orderly processions, to build and rebuild their sacred homes. But behind the calm facade, something human, the spark of individual will, was slowly dimming. For another generation, the illusion would hold. The priests would still command the reins. The artisans would still paint paradise upon their walls. Yet the paradise they painted no longer matched the world outside. The rivers ran thinner. The soil turned pale. The goddess's hands poured water that never reached the fields. Beneath the perfection, hairline cracks began to spread. In Teotihuacan, art was never decoration. It was theology made visible. The breath of gods fixed upon plaster, stone, and clay. Every color, every line, every shape existed for a reason. To walk through its temples was to enter a living scripture where walls spoke in images and silence carried more weight than speech. The city's artisans were not mere craftsmen. They were interpreters of the sacred, trained to translate the unseen into form. Each mural, each carved mask, each sculpted vessel was both offering and revelation. The materials themselves seemed chosen for their elemental power. Obsidian for night and reflection, jade for life and water, shell for the breath of the sea. To hold such an object was to hold a fragment of creation. In the compounds of Tepantitla and Tetitla, painters covered the walls with scenes so intricate that even the gods seemed to move through them. Colors glowed as though drawn from sunlight, deep cinnabar, bright turquoise, the dusty green of volcanic glass. These pigments were made from crushed minerals mixed with lime and sap, their endurance almost supernatural. Centuries later, the murals would still pulse with life, their figures floating between myth and memory. At the heart of this imagery stood the great goddess, serene, immense, and elusive. She was painted wearing a vast headdress of birds and jade, her hands outstretched as she poured water that became flowers, butterflies, and streams. Around her swirled priests, animals, and spirits, all suspended in her fertile domain. Yet beneath the abundance, darker symbols appeared. Spiders, owls, and serpents, reminders that creation was inseparable from death. The painters who rendered her seemed to understand this duality. Their brushwork followed the rhythm of ritual, precise yet fluid. In her eyes they placed no pupils, only white space, an eternal gaze without emotion. She was not a being to adore, but a force to accept, vast and indifferent as the valley itself. To live in Teotihuacan was to live within her body, to breathe her air, to harvest her gifts, and to risk her wrath. Other deities shared the walls. The storm god, with his goggled eyes and jagged lightning bolts. The feathered serpent gliding through clouds. The fire god hunched over his brazier. Yet these were less individuals than aspects of a single cosmic order. Together they formed a pantheon without hierarchy, a circle of powers in perpetual balance. The artists captured that balance through symmetry and rhythm. Their compositions mirrored the geometry of the city, as if every brushstroke reaffirmed the grid that held the world together. In some murals, processions of priests march towards sacred mountains. In others, lines of butterflies rise toward the sun, their wings marked with spirals symbolizing rebirth. There are masks without mouths, faces split between human and animal, and streams of water turning into serpents. To the uninitiated, they might seem dreamlike or chaotic. To the people who lived among them, they were maps of the invisible world. Masks held special power. Crafted from obsidian, jade, or serpentine, they were not worn in life, but placed upon the dead or displayed during ceremonies. Their features were idealized, impassive, and abstract. The face of humanity stripped of individuality. To wear a mask, even briefly, was to dissolve the self and become an instrument of the divine. In the city's rituals, dancers donned them as they moved through clouds of incense, embodying gods rather than portraying them. The same idea shaped sculpture. Figures of priests and deities were rendered with stillness, their expressions frozen in calm authority. There is no frenzy in Teotihuacan's art, no drama, no agony. Emotion was reserved for the viewer, not the subject. The artist sought permanence, not realism, a kind of silence that could outlast empires. Obsidian mirrors, polished to a flawless sheen, were among the city's most mysterious creations. Priests gazed into their depths to divine the will of the gods or the course of the stars. Some believed the mirrors were portals, windows between the living and the dead, between the material and the celestial. When sunlight struck their surface, they reflected nothing but brilliance, erasing both observer and reflection. Through these arts, Teotihuacan revealed its soul, orderly, visionary, and devoted to the eternal. Even the humblest object carried meaning. A painted pot might show a serpent encircling maize, symbolizing the harmony between earth and rain. A simple household altar might depict the fire god crouched over embers, his hands cupped around the promise of renewal. Beauty and ritual were inseparable. The city's architecture shared this devotion to meaning. Temples and courtyards were arranged to echo astronomical alignments. The rising of the Pleiades, the path of Venus, the solstices of the sun. Priests tracked these movements from observatories built atop the temples, noting how the light struck particular walls on sacred days. When dawn fell precisely upon the face of the pyramid of the sun, the moment marked the start of planting season, a fusion of cosmic and earthly time. The art of Teotihuacan was not static. It evolved with the city's ambitions. Early works celebrated fertility and rain. Later ones introduced themes of warfare, sacrifice, and power. Murals began to feature processions of warriors wearing plumed helmets, their shields adorned with the feathers of the serpent. The message shifted subtly. Prosperity came not only from the favor of gods, but from the might of men who served them. Even so, the artists never abandoned the idea of balance. Death and life, creation and destruction, fire and water. These opposites were painted not as contradictions, but as partners. The city's aesthetic was one of equilibrium. A serpent coiled beside a butterfly. A flower bloomed beside a blade. The divine was not pure light or darkness, but the tension between them. In every courtyard, in every temple, Art taught the citizens how to see the world. It told them that their lives were part of a pattern larger than themselves, that work, worship, and sacrifice were all forms of creation. To paint a wall was to affirm existence. To carve a god was to sustain the cosmos. Even the act of sweeping a courtyard before dawn had ritual meaning, echoing the cleansing of the world before the sunrise. When foreigners entered the city, they were struck by this unity of beauty and belief. To their eyes, Teotihuacan was a place where art did not imitate life, but commanded it. The murals glowed with a luminosity unlike anything they had seen. The sculptures radiated an austere calm. In their silence, visitors felt both awe and unease, the sense that the city was alive, watching, and conscious of its own perfection. By the end of the 5th century, the art of Teotihuacan had become its greatest export. In distant lands, the talud tablero style appeared on new temples. Pottery bore designs inspired by its murals. Local gods began to resemble its deities. The city's vision had spread as far as its armies once marched, transforming Mesoamerica not through conquest but through imagination. Even as its influence expanded, a stillness crept into the heart of the metropolis. The murals of later years grew more repetitive, the compositions more rigid. What had once been revelation became doctrine. The same symbols that had once expressed wonder now served as reassurance, reminders that the order of the cosmos and of the state must never change. Art had built the city's identity, and in doing so, had trapped it. The walls of Teotihuacan still shone with divine color, but behind them the people had begun to fade. The city that once worshipped silence now thundered with the sound of marching feet. In the early 6th century, Teotihuacan's calm precision hardened into discipline, and its sacred order turned toward war. The same geometry that had once mapped the heavens began to measure battlegrounds. Change did not come suddenly, nor did it need to. It moved quietly through the temples and compounds, in decrees spoken behind painted walls, in the slow shift of murals from gardens to armies. The priests who had once prayed for rain now blessed weapons. The feathered serpent, long the emblem of divine renewal, became the patron of conquest. The first signs were architectural. In the Ciudadela, the great plaza that had once hosted processions and rituals of peace, fortifications began to rise. Entrances were narrowed, walls thickened, towers added to the corners. The temple of the feathered serpent itself, once a vision of harmony, was sealed behind new platforms of stone. The carvings of serpents and shells disappeared from view, entombed beneath layers of masonry. To the city's citizens, this rebuilding was both a mystery and a warning. The gods were being hidden, or perhaps protected, from the world they had created. The power that directed these changes remained unseen. No chronicler recorded the debates of the ruling council. No sculptor left the likeness of a general or king. But the evidence lay everywhere. In the weapon workshops multiplying across the city, in the warehouses stocked with obsidian blades, in the murals that replaced flowing water with lines of soldiers. The empire that had once expanded through influence now braced itself for defense or dominance. Teotihuacan's armies were not rabble, but institutions of faith. Warriors trained as though performing liturgy. Each carried a shield painted with divine symbols: the spiral of wind, the serpent of rebirth, the eye of the storm god. Their weapons were works of art: obsidian-tipped spears, darts, and knives that gleamed like frozen light. Armor was layered cotton hardened with salt water, decorated with the feathers of eagles and jaguars. To fight was not merely to protect the city, but to reenact the cosmic struggle that had birthed the sun. Ceremonies preceded every campaign. Before the soldiers departed, priests lit fires at the temples, and the warriors danced around them, stamping their feet in unison while drums echoed against the mountains. Blood was drawn from the warriors' ears and tongues, mixed with incense and cast into the flames as an offering. The soldiers went to war purified, as instruments of balance, not aggression. Beyond the valley, Teotihuacan's influence met resistance. The tributary cities that once sent gifts began to assert independence. Trade routes shifted, and the cost of control grew heavy. To maintain its network, the metropolis deployed its armies farther than ever before, through jungles, mountains, and deserts. Some of these expeditions succeeded. Others vanished without trace. The returns diminished, but the ritual of conquest continued, as if war itself had become the last affirmation of divine order. Inside the city, the transformation was visible. Murals now showed processions of warriors in elaborate headdresses, marching across blood-red backgrounds. The great goddess, once a figure of flowing water, appeared surrounded by fire and smoke. Even the walls of domestic compounds bore new motifs: bound captives, spears, shields, reminders that peace was no longer guaranteed. The people learned to live under the watch of their own armies. In workshops, artisans shifted their production. Obsidian tools for farming gave way to weapons. Decorative pottery yielded to military insignia. The same hands that had painted butterflies and rain gods now inscribed jaguars, serpents, and skulls. The change was not despairing. It was dutiful. The citizens of Teotihuacan believed their city to be the center of the universe. If that universe required blood to sustain it, then blood would be given. Still, beneath the pageantry of faith, unease crept through the compounds. Soldiers returned from distant campaigns, bearing stories of burned villages and captives brought to the temples. Families began to fear the summons of the priests, for the line between soldier and sacrifice had grown thin. To die in battle was to be sanctified. To die upon the pyramid steps was to ascend. Either way, the city's gods feasted. The rituals themselves became more theatrical. In the plazas, mock battles were staged before the crowds, ending with real deaths. Prisoners were arrayed in finery, their faces painted with the same calm expressions seen on temple masks. The people watched in reverence as the priest's blade flashed in the sunlight. Blood flowed down the steps like a libation to the earth. The drums did not stop. Children clapped, women sang, and the cycle renewed itself. Behind these spectacles lay the exhaustion of empire. Trade faltered. The obsidian mines yielded less than before. Drought struck the highlands, forcing grain imports from farther south. The priests responded with more sacrifices. The soldiers answered with more campaigns. The machinery of faith had begun to consume itself. Yet even now, Teotihuacan remained magnificent. The pyramid of the sun towered over the valley, its paint still bright beneath the sky. The pyramid of the moon shone pale against Cerro Gordo, its terraces catching the light like frozen waves. From the top, one could see the entire civilization, an ocean of rooftops, a web of canals, and the faint smoke of distant hearths. To stand there was to believe that nothing could end such grandeur. The city's art reflected that illusion of permanence. Murals of this period are strikingly controlled, full of color, but drained of tenderness. Lines are sharper, symmetry stricter, the divine faces expressionless. Every brush stroke insists on order, even as the world around it grows uncertain. In these paintings, the gods no longer nurture, they command. The feathered serpent's cult, once the symbol of creation and wisdom, now dominated civic life. His image appeared on banners, shields, and even the facades of homes. His serpentine body coiled around stairways and courtyards, a constant reminder that the city's fate was entwined with his. Some whispered that the serpent had devoured the goddess, that the balance of heaven and earth had tilted toward fire. In truth, faith and fear had become indistinguishable. The citizens obeyed the rituals not only out of devotion, but because the rituals defined existence itself. To question them was to risk the collapse of the world's rhythm, or worse, the anger of gods who had already grown hungry. And so the people marched, built, and bled, maintaining perfection with trembling hands. From afar, Teotihuacan still appeared eternal, its avenues straight, its temples unbroken, its fires never extinguished. But within its beauty, a kind of silence was forming, the silence that follows exhaustion when a civilization begins to echo itself rather than create. The armies that returned from the front brought home not victory, but stories of famine and rebellion. Tribute arrived late, sometimes not at all. The priests demanded more sacrifices to restore harmony, but even blood began to lose its potency. The city's gods had been fed too long. Now they demanded something greater. No one yet understood that the age of the warriors was also the beginning of the end. The city had conquered the world and found nothing left to master except itself. And in that moment of triumph, Teotihuacan became its own battlefield. Rain came less often. It began with the sky, always with the sky. Seasons that once followed the rhythm of the sacred calendar began to falter. Clouds drifted past the valley without breaking, and the wind that carried their promise instead brought dust. The lakes receded. The canals turned shallow and sluggish. In the fields beyond Teotihuacan's walls, maize withered before reaching the harvest. The city, built to embody order, could not comprehend decay. Priests assured the people that the gods would answer. They had always answered. Processions filled the avenues, the scent of copal thick in the heat. Men and women marched in silence, carrying bowls of water and torches of fire, invoking the balance that had kept their world intact for centuries. Yet the heavens stayed mute. When the drought deepened, the problems ceased to be spiritual and became logistical. The metropolis that once fed half the valley now strained to feed itself. Storehouses emptied. Grain shipments from distant provinces arrived late, their caravans attacked by raiders who had once been allies. Merchants found the roads less safe, the borders less certain. The network that had bound Teotihuacan to the rest of Mesoamerica began to unravel strand by strand. Within the city, disquiet spread. The compounds that had once embodied communal life began to turn inward. Families guarded their stores. Neighbors watched one another with suspicion. Markets grew tense as prices climbed. In the plazas, murmurs replaced music. For the priests, crisis demanded escalation. The rituals intensified. Festivals lengthened into weeks, their fervor half faith, half desperation. New altars were erected. The old ones were rededicated with greater solemnity. Blood offerings, once rare and symbolic, became constant. The gods were hungry, the people were told, and hunger must be met with hunger. Each dawn, the courtyards filled with smoke as sacrifices were performed. Not only captives, but citizens who volunteered or were chosen. Their blood was meant to nourish the dry earth, to rouse the sleeping goddess whose painted hands had ceased to pour water. From the terraces of the Pyramid of the Moon, the priests chanted for rain, but the clouds drifted away like indifferent witnesses. Even as the city prayed, power shifted beneath the surface. The council that once ruled through consensus fractured into factions. Some advocated war, seeking new territories to plunder for food and tribute. Others urged withdrawal, arguing that Teotihuacan must preserve itself rather than its empire. The debates left no visible record, but their consequences spread through every district. Construction slowed, then stopped altogether. Abandoned foundations lay scattered around the Avenue of the Dead, half-completed temples left to crumble. The military, once the instrument of sacred order, began to act as its own authority. Generals and priests competed for influence. Soldiers occupied compounds once reserved for artisans. Warehouses became armories. The discipline that had sustained the empire now turned inward, watching its own citizens. Fear replaced faith as the instrument of control. Still, the rituals continued. The city would not stop performing itself. Festivals marched on, their choreography unchanged even as their purpose decayed. Dancers twirled before empty audiences. Torches were lit for gods that no longer answered. From afar, Teotihuacan appeared as glorious as ever, its pyramids shining, its avenues clean, its symmetry perfect. But beneath the veneer, silence festered. Archaeologists would one day find the evidence: layers of ash, burnt beams, collapsed roofs, signs of unrest rather than invasion. The fires that scarred the temples were not the work of foreign armies, but of the city's own hands. Before that moment of reckoning, there must have been a slow accumulation of despair, a procession that turned riotous, a tax collection resisted, a priest dragged down from his platform. The empire had taught its people how to build and how to burn. Now they remembered the latter. Among the murals of this time, a strange mood appears. Gone are the paradises of water and flowers. In their place are jaguars and serpents, warriors and flames. The great goddess, once radiant, is painted in darker hues. Around her, the world seems to break apart. Butterflies transformed into blades, rivers turned to blood. The artists who painted these scenes were not chroniclers of rebellion. They were witnesses of mood, translating the unease of the city into images the people could not name aloud. Life within the compounds mirrored that tension. Food grew scarce and inequality sharpened. In the richer districts near the central avenue, storage jars remained full, murals bright, and courtyards swept. Farther out, in the sprawling barrios, roofs sagged, altars cracked, and the smell of rot replaced incense. Those who had once come to Teotihuacan seeking safety now dreamed of leaving, though few could. The roads that had carried trade for centuries were watched by soldiers and thieves alike. The priests responded with the only tools they understood: ritual, spectacle, sacrifice. They preached that the sun itself depended on their perseverance. The world, they said, was teetering on the edge of renewal or annihilation. In their theology, every ending was a preparation for rebirth. But rebirth requires death. Night ceremonies grew more frenzied. Fires blazed on every terrace. Flutes and drums filled the darkness with a pulse like a dying heartbeat. From the tops of the pyramids, the city must have looked magnificent, a constellation of flames in a sea of dust. To an outsider, it might have seemed that Teotihuacan still celebrated life. To those within, it was closer to mourning. The balance that had sustained the city for centuries, between priest and soldier, between faith and reason, between beauty and terror, had begun to collapse. The feathered serpent's cult, once the symbol of cosmic order, now served as the banner of war. The great goddess, invoked endlessly for rain, remained silent. Two halves of divinity stared at one another across the valley, and neither moved. Rumors spread of rebellions in distant colonies. Tribute ceased entirely from the south. Merchants began to disappear. When caravans finally reached the city, they brought not goods, but stories. Towns burned, temples looted, alliances dissolved. The world outside no longer obeyed Teotihuacan's design. The rulers, whoever they were by then, reacted with violence. Punishments grew severe. Entire neighborhoods were raided in search of hoarded grain. Foreign residents, once honored guests, became scapegoats. In the Maya quarter, homes were ransacked and temples defaced. The same cosmopolitanism that had once been Teotihuacan's strength turned to suspicion. And yet, even in its disintegration, the city retained a terrible beauty. The pyramids remained unbroken, their outlines still commanding the plain. When the morning sun rose over the Pyramid of the Sun, it shone as it always had, bright, merciless, eternal. People looked up and felt both pride and terror. How could something so vast, so perfect fall? The answer was already forming in the quiet spaces between rituals, in the hollow sound of drums echoing through half-empty plazas. Decline is rarely a single act. It is the fading of conviction. The city that had been built to mirror the heavens now found itself staring into an indifferent sky. No prophecy announced the end. No army came to conquer. Teotihuacan began to die as it had once begun to live, by human hands, slowly, methodically, with faith still burning in its heart. And beneath that faith, the first embers of rebellion began to glow. The end came quietly, like breath leaving a body. For generations, Teotihuacan had lived by rhythm. The sun's rise, the priest's chants, the thrum of drums from the plazas. When the pattern finally broke, it did not shatter all at once. It faltered, hesitated, and then descended into fire. No single day marked the fall. There was no invader's banner, no foreign army marching through its gates. The destruction began from within, born of hunger, fear, and fury long contained. By the early 7th century, the city that had once seemed eternal was choking on its own perfection. The first flames appeared near the temples of the Ciudadela. Witnesses, if any survived, might have seen smoke rising from the roof of the Feathered Serpent's temple, twisting into the grey sky like an omen. Some said the priests set it themselves, cleansing the world through sacred burning. Others whispered of mobs from the outer barrios storming the precincts after years of deprivation. Whoever struck the first torch, the fire caught quickly. Dry plaster flared like parchment. The murals that had sung of abundance blistered and peeled, their gods melting into shapeless color. Roof beams snapped. Shell inlays popped from the walls. The cries of the crowd drowned the chants of the priests. What had been worship turned to riot, and what had been riot turned to purge. The rebels did not strike at random. They moved with a brutal kind of clarity, targeting the symbols of divine order. The temples, the palatial compounds, the storehouses of the elite. Flames consumed the offices where scribes had tallied tribute. Statues of gods were toppled, their faces smashed, their eyes left blind. The Avenue of the Dead, once a processional path for festivals, became a corridor of smoke and screams. The Great Pyramids endured longer. Stone resists what faith cannot. But the smaller sanctuaries that lined the boulevard were gutted, their altars overturned, their treasures looted or buried under ash. Archaeologists centuries later would find the evidence. Layers of charcoal, collapsed roofs, walls blackened from within. It was not war, it was reckoning. No one led this uprising, or if someone did, their name has vanished. The rebellion belonged to the city itself. To the workers, the farmers, the forgotten craftsmen whose hands had built Teotihuacan and whose hunger had broken it. They struck not against an enemy, but against a system of gods and men that had ceased to provide. By the time the fires reached the central avenue, smoke obscured the sun. Drums still sounded from somewhere, but their rhythm was different, frantic, uneven, stripped of ceremony. The murals of the great goddess cracked under heat. The temples of the storm god fell silent. The priests fled or burned where they stood. Those who had once ruled through mystery were exposed, human after all. The destruction spread outward from the core, following the geometry that had once held the city together. Compounds that had mirrored the sacred grid now collapsed in symmetrical ruin. The very design that had symbolized eternity became a map of its own undoing. Even the river that ran beside the avenue turned black with ash, its water carrying fragments of idols downstream. Outside the walls, refugees gathered, watching the sky glow red. They could see the pyramids through the smoke, immense silhouettes outlined in flame. Some wept, others knelt and prayed. Still others simply stared, silent and uncomprehending. Teotihuacan had been their world, and the world was burning. When the fires finally died, the silence that followed was heavier than noise. The air stank of soot and lime. What the rebels had destroyed in days had taken centuries to build. The plazas were littered with the remains of statues and bones, both human and divine. The temples that had once pulsed with drums now stood hollow, their stairways dark with soot. The city's heart had been cut out. Not all of Teotihuacan was destroyed. The residential districts at the margins still stood, their courtyards intact, their shrines blackened but unbroken. The people who survived returned cautiously to their homes. They swept ash from their thresholds, patched their roofs, and tried to restore some semblance of life. But the rhythm was gone. The priests were dead or scattered. The calendars had stopped. In the absence of ritual, time itself seemed to dissolve. Days no longer began with sacred chants, but with the sound of wind moving through empty streets. The markets reopened, smaller, quieter. Children played among the ruins, unaware that their playground had once been the center of the world. The pyramids remained, immense and indifferent. The pyramid of the sun caught the dawn as it always had, but no priests climbed its steps to greet the light. The pyramid of the moon cast its shadow across a city of ghosts. The Avenue of the Dead lived up to its name. What had caused the fire would never be known with certainty. Some later legends claimed divine punishment, that the gods, angered by neglect, descended to reclaim their city in flame. Others believed the people themselves had become the fire, burning away the arrogance of their ancestors. The truth was likely more human. Drought, hunger, division, exhaustion. No empire collapses from a single wound. It dies from 1,000 small fractures that finally meet at the heart. In the years that followed, Teotihuacan did not vanish, but it changed beyond recognition. The great temples were never rebuilt. The ruling families disappeared into legend. The outlying colonies, once bound to the metropolis, declared independence. Trade routes shifted away from the valley. The world moved on. For those who remained, life became smaller and quieter. They planted maize in the courtyards where once they had held festivals. They tore stones from the burned temples to build new homes. The murals faded under sun and rain, their colors turning to dust. Yet some rituals endured. A handful of offerings left at the feet of the old pyramids. A few whispered prayers to the vanished gods. At dusk, when the wind blew from the mountains, the surviving citizens could still hear faint echoes. a sound like drums carried on the air, or perhaps only memory. In their minds, Teotihuacan was not gone, but sleeping, its gods waiting beneath the ash for a day when faith might return. Centuries later, when others came to walk its ruins, they would name it the place where men become gods. But those who watched it burn knew another truth, that even gods could die, and that sometimes death was their final creation. The city's fires burned for days, perhaps weeks. When at last they went out, Teotihuacan lay silent beneath a haze of smoke and dust. From the mountains, the pyramids looked unchanged, serene against the horizon. Only up close could one see the blackened stones, the shattered idols, the emptiness where faith had once lived. Morning returned, but the city no longer rose with it. Smoke had thinned into mist, settling over a landscape of ruins. The air was heavy with silence, not peace, but aftermath. Teotihuacan, once the beating heart of a civilization, now breathed only faintly. The fires had passed, yet their memory clung to every surface. Walls that had once shimmered with color were gray and cracked. The avenue of the dead stretched empty, its symmetry mocking the chaos that had consumed it. In the weeks after the burning, the survivors emerged cautiously from the edges of the city. Families from the outer compounds, farmers, artisans, and wanderers, made their way back toward the center, drawn by habit or hope. They found their temples gutted, their idols broken, their priests gone. What had been sacred was now dust. Still, the people began to rebuild, not out of faith, but out of necessity. They cleared ash from courtyards, patched roofs, and reopened wells. The pyramids still stood, immense and immovable, reminders of what endurance looked like. Beneath their shadows, new gardens sprouted between scorched stones. The valley had known fire before. It would bloom again. But the city that rose from those embers was not the one that had fallen. Without its priesthood, Teotihuacan lost its rhythm. The calendar ceased to rule the days. Festivals went unmarked. Processions no longer wound along the great avenue. People prayed privately to fragments of statues and to memories of gods whose names were already fading. The old order, that perfect symmetry of faith and rule, dissolved into scattered enclaves of survival. In some quarters, life continued almost as before. The apartment compounds, built to endure, remained habitable. Their courtyards still gathered the warmth of the sun, and their wells still yielded water. Small altars flickered with modest offerings, maize, flowers, a few drops of pulque. But the scale of devotion had shrunk. Once, the gods had demanded blood and ceremony. Now they were appeased with silence. The city's grandeur had become its own ghost. Travelers passing through the valley spoke of towers of stone rising from the earth, like the bones of giants. They camped at the edges of the ruins, trading with the survivors who lingered there. From a distance, Teotihuacan still looked intact, its pyramids bright against the sky, its avenues perfectly straight. But inside, weeds grew through the cracks, and the wind carried the sound of nothing. The survivors adapted as best they could. Some turned the ruins into farmland, planting maize in the plazas and beans along the canals. Others scavenged building materials from fallen walls, carving new homes out of old temples. Children played among fragments of murals, their games echoing through chambers once filled with priests. The sacred and the mundane had become one. Foreigners began to visit, drawn by rumor and memory. Traders from Cholula, Xochicalco, and the northern plains arrived to barter obsidian and salt. They walked through the silent city with awe and unease. To them, Teotihuacan was not a ruin, but a warning. proof that even perfection could perish. Yet they could not resist its pull. Some settled in the outskirts, repairing dwellings, repainting walls, restoring fragments of art. The metropolis became a gathering place once more, though its unity was gone. In this new era, Teotihuacan was less a city than a constellation of villages scattered among colossal monuments. Each community had its own customs and deities, many adopted from neighboring lands. The Zapotecs rebuilt their quarter. Maya merchants reopened workshops. Nahua-speaking farmers claimed the fields by the river. The result was a mosaic of peoples living amid the bones of empire, bound together only by proximity and awe. The old gods survived in fragments. The great goddess, once painted across vast walls, lingered in small household figurines. The feathered serpent became a symbol of protection rather than conquest. The fire god's image appeared on new altars, smaller, humbler, but still tended with care. Religion no longer ruled the city. It sustained it quietly, like an ember under ash. At night, the survivors lit torches along the avenue. The flames flickered against the soot-stained walls, illuminating the ghosts of murals, wings, flowers, serpents, half erased by fire. Children were told that the gods had not died, but withdrawn into the mountains, watching to see if humanity would remember them. And so, once or twice each year, small groups climbed the pyramids to leave offerings, shells, food, or tears. The rituals no longer fed a state, only memory. For all its loss, life did not vanish. The same river that had once been diverted to fit the city's design still flowed, though quietly now, winding through abandoned districts. Wildflowers grew where marketplaces had stood. Birds nested in the crevices of temples. The valley was reclaiming what men had built, but gently, as if in mourning. From the surrounding hills, travelers could still see Teotihuacan's outline gleaming in the sun. To those who had never known its living pulse, it seemed eternal. They could not imagine the noise it once made. The bells, the chants, the hammers, the crowds. To them, it was already myth, a city built by gods and deserted by men. Among the survivors, age brought resignation. They no longer spoke of restoring the old empire. Instead, they spoke of endurance. The pyramids had survived the fire. Perhaps their people could survive the loss. They taught their children to respect the ruins, to leave offerings, to remember names they no longer understood. In time, those children would grow and leave, carrying fragments of Teotihuacan's memory to new settlements across the valley. Centuries later, echoes of those refugees could still be found. Their architecture in Cholula, their murals in Xochicalco, their rituals alive in distant towns. Through them, the spirit of Teotihuacan wandered long after its heart had gone still. And yet, for a few decades more, the city endured in shadow. Smoke-stained walls sheltered new generations. The Avenue of the Dead became a road for herders and traders. The pyramids watched over it all, indifferent and magnificent. Each dawn, sunlight struck the top of the Pyramid of the Sun, just as it always had, spreading warmth across a city too proud to vanish completely. Farmers in the fields would look up, see the stone gleaming, and feel a strange comfort, as though the gods had not abandoned them entirely. Teotihuacan was no longer the city where men became gods. It had become something quieter, a place where men remembered that gods too could fall. But in that remembrance lay its endurance. What had burned was power. What remained was presence. Long after its rulers were forgotten, Teotihuacan still held the valley in its silence. And in that silence, the pulse of history went on beating. Centuries passed, and the fires of Teotihuacan cooled into legend. The city that once ruled valleys and skies became a ruin, wrapped in silence, its pyramids gleaming like fossils of faith. Wind moved through its corridors, where chants had once echoed. The people who had lived and died within its walls were long gone, yet their presence remained, not as ghosts, but as memory carved into stone. New generations rose in the valley, born among the ruins. To them, Teotihuacan was not history, but landscape, a set of mountains built by forgotten hands. They grazed animals in its plazas, planted maize in the shadows of its temples, and used its broken walls as shelter from the rain. But when dusk came and the pyramids turned black against the burning horizon, even the most practical among them felt unease. The city seemed too deliberate, too perfect, to have been made by mortals. Out of that unease, myth began to take shape. The people of the highlands, seeking origins for their world, turned to the silent stones for answers. They told stories of gods who had gathered here when the sky was still dark, gods who cast themselves into fire to bring forth the sun. The pyramids became their tombs or their thrones, depending on who told the tale. In the darkness before creation, it was said, this was the place where the world began anew. The name came later, passed through tongues that no longer remembered its builders, Teotihuacan, the place where men become gods. It was both explanation and confession. No other phrase could capture what stood before them. Pilgrims began to arrive. They came barefoot and quiet, climbing the steps of the Pyramid of the Sun as the dawn broke. On its summit, they left offerings of maize, feathers, and polished obsidian. They whispered prayers to the nameless powers that still seemed to dwell there. The wind at the top was fierce, carrying their voices across the plain. When they descended, they did so with a sense of having touched something holy, though they could not say why. These pilgrimages gave the ruins new life. Small shrines appeared at the foot of the pyramids, tended by priests who claimed to speak with the old gods. Markets returned, modest at first, then growing as more travelers came. Traders sold incense and charms said to contain the power of the ancients. Children played among toppled walls, their laughter echoing where prayers once did. To the Toltecs, who rose centuries later in the north, Teotihuacan became the axis of creation. Their poets described it as the place where time began, where the first sun rose and the fourth died. They believed the gods had assembled there to renew the world after every cataclysm. In their mythology, this valley was the workshop of the divine, a forge where light itself had been remade. When Toltec rulers visited the site, they treated it as pilgrimage rather than conquest. They climbed the pyramids barefoot, carrying torches and flowers. On the altars, they placed effigies of their own gods, merging old names with new faces. The feathered serpent lived again, now as Quetzalcoatl, the god of wisdom and wind. The great goddess re-emerged in fragments, as Chalcutlicue, as Coatlicue, as unnamed mothers of the earth. The people no longer remembered Teotihuacan's theology, but its imagery endured like a language half understood. Each new culture added another layer to the myth. The Totonacs and Otomi spoke of divine architects who had shaped the pyramids in a single night. The Chichimecs, arriving later from the north, claimed their ancestors had descended from its heights. To every people who stood in awe of its vastness, the city offered a mirror. They saw in it the proof that their world was born of fire and sacrifice. By the 8th century, Teotihuacan had become a kind of oracle in stone. Kings sent emissaries to consult its priests, seeking legitimacy in the shadow of the pyramids. To rule from the valley was to rule from the center of the cosmos. Even those who built new cities, at Cholula, at Tula, at Xochicalco, shaped them in its image. The grid, the pyramids, the ceremonial avenues, all were echoes of the forgotten metropolis. Artists continued to imitate its style. The talud tablero facade appeared on temples far beyond the valley, as if the old geometry carried divine sanction. Murals painted centuries after its fall still bore the same motifs: serpents, water, butterflies, and eyes wide with cosmic awareness. Teotihuacan's art had outlived its religion. What had once been faith was now inheritance. In the ruins themselves, life lingered like a whisper. Hermits settled in the caves beneath the Pyramid of the Sun, claiming to hear the voices of the gods. Farmers tilled soil enriched by centuries of ash, and shepherds used the smaller temples as pens for their animals. From time to time, earthquakes shook the valley, dislodging old stones and revealing buried chambers. Each discovery renewed awe and speculation. No one dared to rebuild on the same scale, as if to rival the old gods would invite their wrath. As centuries rolled on, Teotihuacan ceased to be a ruin of the past and became a presence in the present. To later generations, it was less a city than a revelation, proof that the divine had once walked among men. Its pyramids marked not just the memory of empire, but the enduring question of where humanity ended and godhood began. The Aztecs, arriving long after the Toltecs had faded, adopted that memory as their own. They believed the fifth sun, their world, had been born from Teotihuacan's fires. To them, the city was the navel of creation, the place where the gods had sacrificed themselves so that light could exist. When their rulers spoke of destiny, they spoke from the shadow of its pyramids. Yet long before the Aztecs' arrival, Teotihuacan had already completed its transformation. It was no longer a city that lived or ruled or worshipped. It had become an idea, the vision of eternity made solid, a monument to both human greatness and human loss. Its stones no longer served the living, they instructed the dead. Each evening, as the sun descended behind Cerro Gordo, its rays brushed the Pyramid of the Sun in gold. To the farmers in the valley, that light seemed deliberate, as if the old gods were still speaking through their architecture. In that brief blaze, the city was reborn, only to fade again into dusk. What had begun as empire had become memory. What had fallen to ruin had risen as myth. Teotihuacan's builders were forgotten, but their silence proved louder than any record. The city that once turned men into gods had achieved its own divinity, not through power, but through remembrance. Long after Teotihuacan had fallen silent, its shadow lingered across the heart of Mexico. Civilizations rose and vanished, yet the old pyramids still caught the sun each morning. The valley seemed bewitched, a place where every new people felt compelled to return. To walk its avenues was to confront the ghosts of beginnings. By the 10th century, the Toltecs had come to power in Tula, a city of warriors and philosophers. They knew Teotihuacan only as a myth, a sacred ruin half claimed by the earth. When their kings first visited, they did so barefoot, carrying flowers and torches. The pyramids loomed ahead, vast and silent, their summits veiled by mist. Even in ruin, they dwarfed anything the Toltecs had built. To them, these were not monuments, but mountains shaped by divine hands. The Toltec priests declared the valley the Tollan of the gods, the heavenly prototype of their own capital. They taught that Teotihuacan had been the place of cosmic renewal, where light was reborn after each destruction of the world. To honor that legend, They revived the cult of the feathered serpent, calling him Quetzalcoatl, the bringer of wisdom and dawn. His name became both a deity and a title for their kings, who claimed descent from his spirit. In the plazas of Tula, they built temples that echoed the old geometry, terraces aligned to the sun, walls slanted in the talud tablero style. Sculptors carved serpents and shells on their facades, never realizing they were recreating symbols whose meaning had already changed a dozen times. The imitation was not flattery, but devotion, a way to connect their age to an eternal one. Teotihuacan had ceased to be a place. It was now a lineage of ideas. By then, the city's ruins had become a pilgrimage site. Travelers from across Mesoamerica journeyed to the valley to leave offerings at the feet of its pyramids. They came bearing obsidian mirrors, maize, and small effigies of Quetzalcoatl and Tlaloc. Some climbed the ancient stairs at sunrise, believing the light that touched the summit would cleanse their souls. Others sought visions in the caves beneath the Pyramid of the Sun, where water still glimmered faintly in the dark. In those subterranean chambers, myths were reborn. Priests taught that the cave beneath the Great Pyramid was the womb of creation, the place from which the gods emerged when the world was young. The idea spread like fire through later cultures. From the highlands to the coasts, temples were raised upon artificial caves, and the story of the birth of the sun took root as cosmic truth. As centuries passed, the valley saw waves of new settlers, Chichimek tribes moving south from the deserts, Otomi farmers from the hills, Nahua speakers from the west. Each group found the ruins waiting for them, immense and unyielding. They built villages around the edges, scavenging stones for their homes, but never daring to touch the pyramids. Even stripped of plaster and paint, the monuments radiated something untouchable. To alter them felt sacrilegious. The people who now lived among the ruins told stories to explain their presence. Some said the pyramids were the tombs of giants who had built the world before the flood. Others believed they were the petrified remains of gods who had turned to stone after creating the sun. Children grew up hearing that when the world ended again, as it surely would, the gods would return to this place to kindle a new dawn. By the 13th century, the valley had become a mosaic of small kingdoms. None were powerful enough to claim Teotihuacan, yet all paid it reverence. Envoys brought gifts to its shrines, seeking divine favor for harvests and war. Pilgrims traced the old avenue of the dead, now half buried under earth and grass. They whispered prayers in Nahuatl, Otomi, and Mixtec, many languages, one awe. It was around this time that the Mexica, later known as the Aztecs, entered the Central Plateau. They were wanderers then, searching for the promised land foretold by their god, Huitzilopochtli. When they reached the valley and saw the pyramids rising out of the mist, they stopped in silence. To them, this could not have been built by mortals. Here, they decided, was the birthplace of the sun itself, the site of the god's self-sacrifice that had set time in motion. The Mexica adopted the name already whispered by others, Teotihuacan, but they gave it deeper weight, calling it the axis of creation, the point where heaven and underworld touched. They believed that when the gods gathered to create the current world, the fifth sun, it was here they had kindled the sacred fire. In their chronicles, Teotihuacan became not a ruin, but a beginning, repeated forever. Aztec priests incorporated its myths into their own theology. The ritual of the new fire, held every 52 years to renew the cosmos, was said to echo the sacrifice of the gods at Teotihuacan. In that ceremony, they extinguished every flame in the empire and waited for dawn. When the first spark was lit atop a sacred hill, It was as though the fires of Teotihuacan had flared again. Emperors visited the ruins in solemn procession. Moctezuma II, fascinated by antiquity, made pilgrimages there, walking barefoot through the dust. Chroniclers later claimed that he climbed the Pyramid of the Sun to commune with the spirits of the ancients. Standing at its summit, he gazed over the valley and saw not ruin, but prophecy, the reflection of his own empire in the stones of another. For him, Teotihuacan was both warning and promise, a reminder that even divine cities could burn, but also that divinity could be born from ashes. Aztec artisans restored fragments of the site. They repaired altars, replastered walls, and rededicated shrines to their own gods. Yet they preserved its mystery. No Aztec claimed to know who had built it, nor did they try to uncover its secrets. To them, ignorance was reverence. The less understood, the more sacred it became. The valley itself regained vitality under their care. Markets appeared near the ruins. Farmers cultivated the fields once more. Pilgrims arrived daily, leaving offerings at the feet of the pyramids. The site became both a sanctuary and a lesson, a living dialogue between past and present. And yet, amid this reverence, the air of foreboding never lifted. The Aztecs, masters of empire, could not forget that Teotihuacan had also been an empire, one that had ruled as they now ruled, and had fallen as they one day might. Moctezuma's priests taught that history was a wheel, not a ladder. Each sun rose only to die again, and every civilization repeated the pattern of the last. When night fell, the pyramids vanished into shadow, their outlines barely visible against the stars. Priests said that in those hours the old gods stirred, whispering to the living from beneath the stones. Sometimes travelers camping near the ruins claimed to see faint lights moving along the avenue, sparks that flickered and vanished. Whether flame, spirit, or imagination, no one dared to follow. By the 14th century, Teotihuacan stood once more at the heart of a world it no longer ruled. The Aztecs, inheritors of its legend, treated it as the cradle of all things. They named it Holy Ground and swore that when the fifth sun ended, the gods would return there to kindle the next. The city had become the mirror of eternity, its builders forgotten, its purpose transfigured, its silence alive with prayer. At dawn, the sun still climbed the same sky it had watched for 2,000 years. Its first light touched the summit of the Pyramid of the Sun, spilled down the terraces of the moon, and crept along the Avenue of the Dead, just as it had when Teotihuacan lived. The city no longer spoke, but it still remembered. The stones held the pattern of a vanished heartbeat. By the 15th century, Teotihuacan was sacred again. The Aztecs had woven it into their cosmology, naming it the cradle of the gods. They told that here, when the world lay in darkness, the divine gathered to decide who would become the new sun. Two deities cast themselves into a sacred fire. Nanahuatzin, humble and scarred, and Tecuchiztecatl, proud and radiant. From the flames, the sun and moon were born. The gods then gave their blood to set them in motion. The myth was older than the Aztecs, older than language itself, but in Teotihuacan it found its home. Each year, pilgrims retraced that cosmic story. They came before sunrise, climbing the Great Pyramid barefoot, carrying torches and bowls of flowers. As the first light appeared, they raised their arms and chanted the names of the gods who had died to create day. The wind tore at their voices, scattering them over the valley like offerings. No one knew the names of the builders anymore, but everyone felt their presence in the weight of the stones, in the way the light always found its mark. Moctezuma II, Emperor of the Mexica, often visited the site in secret. He would arrive with only a few attendants, leaving his guards behind at the base of the avenue. Chroniclers later claimed he spoke little on those journeys. He walked the length of the city slowly, touching the scorched walls, gazing up at the pyramids that dwarfed his own palaces. To his priests, he admitted a fear that his empire, like theirs, might one day fall to fire. At night, he ordered the temples of Tenochtitlan lit to mirror those of Teotihuacan, so that the old gods would see that their legacy endured. But perhaps he understood what those gods had learned long ago, that perfection is heavy and that every empire carries the seed of its own eclipse. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, they found the valley quiet. Teotihuacan's ruins stood as they had for centuries, stripped of plaster, wind-carved, yet still imposing. To the conquistadors, they were beyond comprehension. Bernal Diaz del Castillo wrote that when the Spaniards first saw the pyramids rising from the plain, they thought they were towers of some vast and deserted city, the work of giants. Their guides told them, reverently, that this was Teotihuacan, the place where gods had walked. The invaders recorded what they saw, but did not understand it. They dug for treasure and found only earth. They climbed the pyramids and saw no idol waiting at the top. They marveled at the view, at the sheer expanse of the valley, and then moved on. To them, Teotihuacan was a curiosity, not a revelation. Yet even they, hardened by conquest, felt its gravity. One friar wrote that the silence there pressed upon the soul like the memory of a dream. The Aztec world soon followed its forerunner into ruin. The same fires that had once consumed Teotihuacan now fell upon Tenochtitlan. The wheel of suns turned once more. Amid the collapse, the myths survived. Priests captured by the Spaniards whispered of Teotihuacan until their dying breaths, of how the gods had sacrificed themselves to sustain the world, and how that cycle could never truly end. In the centuries that followed, the city slept beneath dust and legend. Farmers ploughed its outskirts, unaware they were turning soil that once fed 1 million mouths. Travelers wrote of strange mounds rising from the plain, covered in grass, inhabited only by birds. The pyramids became hills. The Avenue of the Dead became a path for herders. Nature folded the city into its own geometry, patient and deliberate. Then, slowly, curiosity returned. Explorers and scholars came with shovels instead of torches. They cleared earth from the temples, revealing again the faces of serpents and gods. In the early 20th century, the Pyramid of the Sun was rebuilt from ruin. Not perfectly, but enough to wake it. When the scaffolding fell away, the stone gleamed once more under the Mexican sky. After nearly 15 centuries, the city had opened its eyes again. Visitors began to climb its steps. They spoke languages the builders had never known, carrying cameras instead of offerings. Yet the sensation at the summit remained unchanged. The wind fierce, the valley vast. The sense of standing at the edge of something eternal. No matter how modern the pilgrim, each felt the same quiet awe that had once moved the Toltecs and the Aztecs. The city's power no longer depended on religion. It had become the embodiment of memory itself. Archaeologists mapped its streets, measured its temples, and uncovered its art. They found traces of color, fragments, murals still vivid beneath the dust. They found human remains buried beneath the pyramids, confirming what legend had long whispered, that the city had been consecrated in blood. They found obsidian blades, incense burners, pottery, jewelry, a world frozen at the moment of faith. And though they uncovered much, the most important questions remained unanswered. Who had ruled? Why had they burned their own city? How had they built such perfection, only to erase it? Teotihuacan gives answers only in echoes. Its silence is not ignorance, but choice. It speaks through geometry, through the alignment of its stones with stars, through the whisper of wind along its avenues. To stand within it is to feel the persistence of what cannot be explained, the stubborn endurance of mystery. At sunrise, the light still touches the same sequence of stone. The sun slides across the valley, bathing the city in gold. Tourists take photographs, children laugh, and somewhere a bird cries above the pyramid of the moon. It is no longer a city of gods or kings, yet it remains what it has always been, a mirror. It reflects each generation's hunger for power, for faith, for meaning, and returns it magnified. Teotihuacan endures because it was never just architecture. It was a question turned into a landscape. What can humanity make that might outlast itself? The builders answered with stone and silence. The centuries have not found a better reply. Every day the sun rises over the pyramid of the sun, as it has since the first brick was laid. Every evening it sinks behind Cerro Gordo, gilding the valley one last time. Between those moments, the city holds its breath, unchanging. Civilizations are born, conquer, and vanish, yet the light always returns. And so, the city of the gods remains, not alive, not dead, but eternal.